right, my friends, welcome to another episode of the CoreLink Solution, where we look to empower you with awareness and actionable insights. For those of you joining us during the live stream, thank you as always for being a part of it. Please feel free to ask your questions within the comments section of Facebook or chat on YouTube, and we will do our very best to answer them. Tonight's conversation is focused on truly the words systemic and institutional. As such, you might ask, why are we talking about institutions of higher education? And to that point, let me give you some background. As an employer, higher education institutions are the largest employers in 10 states, as well as 2/3 of America's 100 largest cities. Overall, U.S. colleges and universities have endowments valued at nearly $600 billion, employ nearly 4 million people, or more than 2.5% of the population. Colleges and universities cultivate entrepreneurship, they incubate businesses, and those who attend college are twice as more likely to own a small business than those with high school education or less. So all told, higher education has a tremendous impact on the state of our culture, our economy, and more. And so what we want to do is have a very vibrant conversation tonight, and I could think of no one better to invite than someone I consider a friend, a colleague, and specifically to this topic, an ally, and Greg Hanifee. Greg, welcome to the conversation.
James, it's really my pleasure. Thank you very much for having me in tonight.
Absolutely. And let me properly introduce Greg. Greg serves as the Associate Dean of Degree Programs and Operations for the Kellogg School of Management at Northwestern University, where he oversees the portfolio of degree programs, student life operations, admissions, global program offerings, career management, and academic experience. Prior to his recent appointment, he served as the Dean of Executive MBA Global Network since joining Kellogg in 2013 after 4 years at the University of Maryland's Smith School of Business. Prior to University of Maryland, Greg spent 20 years in the telecom industry, and he also launched German-U.S. design agency in Shanghai in 2006 and served as the board of directors there until 2019. On a personal note, he also earned his BS in chemistry from University of Delaware and MBA from University of Maryland, and him and his wife, PK, live in Chicago and have 2 children, Tess and Jack. So again, Greg, so happy to have you with me this evening.
Yeah, James, no, it's really excited to join you for this conversation. And you're giving me, that title is a mouthful, all the different roles and responsibilities. But I have to say, having the opportunity to work with folks like yourself have really created a platform for me to succeed. So we might get into that a little bit later, too, in the conversation.
That'd be great. Thank you, Greg. So before we jump into the meat of the conversation, I always like to ask a question and kind of give folks the opportunity to get to know you a little bit, if you can. And having known you for a while now, it's just going to be hard because you share pretty openly. What's one thing you think you can share that most people don't know about you?
Yeah, I think a lot of people assume that I grew up in a big city because I've lived in a lot of big cities for my whole life. DC, Prague, Shanghai, Chicago. I actually grew up on a rural state road in Maryland, working on dairy farms for 12 years old up until I went away to college. And I knew I didn't want to be a dairy farmer, so I got out of town as fast as I could, using education, which we're kind of gonna talk about tonight. But my roots go back to a pretty simple way of living, and I think that typically surprises people.
Yeah, absolutely. So did you disappoint the family, father, your grandfather, etc.?
Grandfather, probably. I think my father was an educator. He taught middle school and high school. My mother was an operating room nurse. So I think they were quite happy that I found a better path. But I think there's certainly family members out there that probably wish I was there helping them with the cows and everything else. Yeah.
We're glad you decided to take another path. So as we go into this a little bit, I set some of the context for people around higher education, but what would you add to that? And, maybe start specifically with Kellogg to get some sense of scale. On an annual basis, how many people and professionals do you help at Kellogg?
So Kellogg is a graduate school. We'll start there. So some schools, business schools, serve undergraduate and graduate audiences, but Kellogg has about 2,600 students every year coming through the doors, either first year, second year, or there for doctoral programs, which might be 4 to 5 years or longer. We sit as part of Northwestern University, which has about 22,000 total students in population, predominantly undergraduate. But we're outside of Chicago in Evanston. We have a satellite campus in Miami that serves our executive MBA program. We have global partnerships, Hong Kong, Beijing, Tel Aviv, Germany, and Toronto. But it's a pretty vibrant educational community. To your point earlier about staff and employment and et cetera, Northwestern University, Chicago itself is home to a lot of universities. And when you start to think about all the people that are employed throughout the university systems, it's a big part of the economy of Chicago, I have to say. Some of my brothers and sisters that work at DePaul or Loyola, University of Chicago, University of Illinois in Chicago. It's quite the fabric of our city, and probably not too dissimilar to Philly, where you're based, James.
Yeah, absolutely. And when you think about that, to that point, being a part of the fabric and its far-reaching impacts, as you have, been trying to process this, right? When you think about the events of George Floyd and all the other events that have happened, right? Because there's just been so many. How have you been processing that?
Yeah, I'll tell the audience that you teed up this question for me a week ahead of time, so I'm very grateful for that. But I think it's still a daily process for me, James. I think originally I was just trying to understand how this could happen today, right? I think like many people, and for me, I think understanding, I think for the first time, what it meant to be an ally. I'd heard that term before. I think our students absolutely use it. And starting with reaching out to Black and brown friends and checking on them, going through that process of not even knowing what to say or what to ask,
Right.
and learning from them, very, very gracious in terms of helping me go through that. And then I think starting to reflect on what is my role in all this. And as a leader at an institution, as somebody that gets to help shape and influence people's lives when they come into an institution of learning, I have a voice that probably matters. So what do I need to do, not just to talk, but also to show action? How do I convene the right conversations? So I think for me, it's been a process of understanding what my responsibility is to actually make change happen, because we're at the point where change has to happen. And I think we'll talk about this a little bit more, whether it's Kellogg or other places. It's great to be, I think it's great to be an ally, but it's what are you going to do with that?
Right.
As well. And I think we're learning there are different places on the spectrum of being an ally, and there's a space for everybody along that spectrum. But I also had to think about personally, what does it mean for me, and what do I need to do? Yeah. I think we chatted a couple of weeks ago. You were kind enough to join for a conversation with some of your fellow alums and an audience at Kellogg. And after that evening conversation, I was a little bit down, because I was so emotionally moved by what everybody had to say. There was also optimism in the conversation, but to me, talking wasn't enough. What were we going to do? And one of the panelists, Rhea Aiken, called me and she said, at this point in time, this is what we need to do. We need to have conversations, and we need to have conversations with people of all colors, of all walks of life, so they understand. So for me, I think, James, it is going to be a continuous evolution of taking steps. What actions can I take today? What can I do tomorrow? And then also trying to be an influencer at Kellogg to make things happen as well.
Yeah. Yeah. That's good. The words you said around trying to figure out what your role is, I think are words that probably resonate with a lot of people. And I think there are a lot of words that are either coming to light for the first time. Like I've never heard the word allyship so much, right?
Yeah.
Um, or they're coming to light in a different way. Like I'll give you an example. Last week or it was the week before, the word empathy had never hit me as hard before. And I made a post around it and I said, there's such a distance between hearing and empathy. And I just literally wrote down the definition between hearing, listening, effective listening, and empathy, and how different it is, right? And empathy being defined as understanding and sharing in the feelings of another. And when you think about that, sharing in the
feelings, yeah,
right? And to understand and then share in the feelings that someone's saying, man, this house is on fire. Like my house is on fire, right? To share that feeling.
Yeah.
So when I say the words, for example, systemic racism or institutional racism, what comes to mind? And I actually like to read a small passage. I was looking at this passage from, this is from Black Power, The Politics of Liberation by Kwame Ture, formerly known as Storm Carmichael and Charles Hamilton. It says racism is both overt and covert. It takes two closely related forms. I'll skip through some of it because it's a long read. But we call these individual racism and institutional racism. The first consists of overt acts by individuals which cause death, injury, or the violent destruction of property. This type can be recorded by television cameras. It frequently can be observed in the process of commission. The second type is less overt, far more subtle, less identifiable in terms of specific individuals committing the acts, but it is no less destructive of human life. The second type originates in the operation of established and respected forces in society and thus receives far less public condemnation than the first type. What?
Yeah, no, it's powerful when you reflect on how oppressive that really is for people, right? Because it's the overt side of things. I think it's we talk a lot about bias, right? And we research this at Kellogg, and I know it's something that's done at many universities and studied by many psychologists as well. And the biases and implicit biases that we have are shaped by our environment, right? And at some level, I think what's happened leading up to and with the unfortunate death of George Floyd has forced a lot of us to think about where did these biases come from, and are we turning that into overt racism, moving into more institutional or systemic racism. So, I think in higher ed, just like any university, there are systemic challenges to people of color who want to move on into study. So, for example, I think the percentage of students going into undergraduate study over the past, let's say in 2018, I think it was about 62% of those students who were Black or brown graduating from high school went on to undergraduate study. And I, living in the graduate school world, right, this is what's happened is sort of widened my eyes to the fact that they typically carry more financial debt as they go through that than a white counterpart, right? And typically, more often than not, it's a higher level of debt. It's not just the percentage of people that have to borrow, and there's a lower percentage of people that get support from their parents who are Black and brown than white. So part of this starts with the whole wealth gap that exists between Black and brown people and white people. So then in the graduate world, we start thinking about, okay, what is the opportunity for us to educate at the graduate school level, um, you know, Black and brown people. There's sort of this limit because of financial considerations
Mm-hmm.
that can only be solved in the short term by more scholarships. So, at Kellogg, like a lot of business schools, we sort of are stuck in this 14% representation of Black students within the population at MBA schools. And the Wall Street Journal just had an article about this. That's not going to change. There's a systemic problem. That's not going to change until some of the previous steps in the whole process can also change.
Can you explain
Now,
that a little bit, that 14% piece?
sure. So if you look at the population of students who are studying at the graduate school level,
Mm-hmm.
in business, so some may go to law, some may go to medicine, some may go to education, et cetera. But the latest statistics I think I saw in 2018 from the Council of Graduate Schools, the percentage of Black or African American self-declared students studying business is about 14%.
Right.
So 31,000 students, 32,000 students across the entire U.S. population. And that could be a private school, public school, private for-profit. So I think when we start to talk about systemic challenges in higher education, it actually starts at kids coming out of high school, going into college to begin
Mm-hmm.
with, and what they're already burdened with in order to move forward.
Mm-hmm.
So we've got to think differently about how we change the equation much earlier in the process. Is sort of what I'm talking about from a systemic perspective, and how do we create the other systemic challenges. If you think about applying to business school, you have to take the GMAT. Well, a lot of kids, if they want to do really well in the GMAT, they have to pay for prep classes or pay for a tutor.
Right.
And that's not possible in some socioeconomic situations. It goes back to the SAT, just getting into undergraduate school as well. So I think from a societal perspective, there are things that institutions can change internally, but there are also these broader questions that we have to start to address as well.
Yeah. Yeah. It's good.
I think so some other statistics I think for your audience, going into getting a bachelor's degree, right? The good news is the percentage of Black and African Americans between the ages of 25 and 29 years old in 2000 was 18%. In 2018, it was all the way up to 29%.
Mm.
So that's progress.
Mm-hmm.
But you compare it to white people 25 to 29, they were already at 34% in 2000, nearly double for Black or African American. And they also went up 11% to 45% by 2018. So,
Mm.
the percentages aren't necessarily changing.
Right.
More people, fortunately, are able to go through, higher ed. But we got to think about shifting the balance, I think, a little bit more relative to the population.
Absolutely. And to that point, when you think about what is in higher education's control, so to speak, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
What do you think some of the biggest areas of opportunity are?
Yeah. Great question. So, and I like the way you phrase it. There's some things in our control and some things that are outside. I think I'm going to start actually with something that's a little bit higher on the hierarchy in terms of what we can do to influence. So companies want to hire our students,
Mm-hmm.
right? We should be thinking about how we work with those companies to ensure that they actually have environments that are conducive to representing diverse equitable, inclusive environments, and make a choice about how much we want to partner and lean into them, right?
Mhm.
Because if our graduates are going to go out and be the great, extraordinary, empathetic leaders that we want them to be, they've got to have environments that they're going to thrive in and feel comfortable in. So that's sort of at the tail end of the spectrum, but that's really important to start having those conversations with companies that want to come hire our students, because then I'm going to get to what do we do when the students are with us. And I think my philosophy, working with students and working in what we call the student life arena, is you've got to create a house where people feel valued, where they feel that they're there with their whole worth. And if you can do that, then other potential students are going to be attracted to it, because there will be this viral effect of, if I feel comfortable where I am and I can be myself and I feel like it's an inclusive environment where I can thrive, that's what we need at Kellogg. That's what every institution should strive for. Then you start to think about, who do I need to go to attract to come to my school? And how do I get that 14% of students who are Black or African American to be 20%
Right,
or
right,
even 17%?
right.
But if I bring them in and they're not having the experience that they're going to thrive in, it doesn't matter if I hit 17% for a couple of years. It's not going to create the change that I feel the school has an accountability
Yep.
to be able to create. So then you step back even further. So now we're talking about, how do we find the best and brightest and most talented students to come in? And there we have to think differently as well. We have to think about talking to potential students even when they're in undergrad. So they may work for 5 years and then come to Kellogg, or 15 years and come to Kellogg.
Mhm.
But how do we tell the story of what it means to have the opportunity to come to Kellogg, to have the network that enables them, um, and help shape the story, not in a way that we're ad people, but shape the story so they understand that there's the potential for them to do even more if they stretch their thinking and think higher.
Yeah.
There uh, internal things we can control. How do we think about um, the cases that we teach, and are they representative of all walks of life, Black, Brown, Latinx, um, and then also the faculty.
Yeah.
I think, how do we develop faculty with a broad view of what inclusivity means, a view of where people come from and why that matters, and their interpretation of different problems and how they might approach solving those problems. And then there's also a recruitment question around people of color that would be faculty, and
Mhm.
how do you make that happen?
Mhm.
So there is actually a lot under our control, and I think that's where Kellogg is right now, and prioritizing both with uh, the leadership, the students, the alumni, about how we're going to move this forward.
Yeah. Got it. No, those are some good thoughts. And when you think about piercing the hallways of corporations and trying to create an environment that will not only welcome those individuals in, but help them, for lack of better terms, matriculate, right, and get toward
Mm-hmm.
the right seats. I mean, my God, we've seen the business case diversity years, right? I mean, that business case has been shown, repeated, reheated, rebroadcast.
Yeah.
I mean, it should be on Netflix by now, okay, as a series. Um, what would have to be drastically different to really make it take hold in your mind?
um, James, you're absolutely right. I mean, I think Kellogg, as a school of collaboration, has long professed that diverse teams outperform
Right.
2.5 times teams that are homogeneous. And these studies have been going on for a long time. So what's taken us so long for the business world to actually see that and implement it? I think an event like what just happened,
Mm-hmm.
unfortunately for George Floyd and his family, the conversations that I've had over the past couple of weeks
Mm-hmm.
do give me some optimism when I talk to alums that are at these companies. And there has to be movement from lip service to action. I think there also has to be an employee uprising in a way
Yeah.
to demand and hold companies accountable. I think it's not exactly the same thing, but I also see what's happening with Facebook right now, and companies pulling their advertising because they're not monitoring what's actually happening, and the hate and vitriol that happens on Facebook. Other companies can speak with their money and not buy services from, let's say, XYZ company. And that, I think that's what it goes back to is um, change happens. And this is something that we're talking about a lot at Kellogg. Change happens when you have leaders who are committed to it, but also put the right processes in place.
Right.
To take people from just being vocal and animated where they are right now. And it's taking a moment. Somebody told me this the other day. It's taking a moment and turning it into a movement, right? So the moment it culminated with George Floyd's death. Now it's the movement.
Right.
The other reason I have optimism, I think, is I think about my children are in their 20s. That generation is not tolerating a lot of standing around and not doing anything. So if there's a way to continue to keep them energized, and also they'll walk away from jobs much more easily than maybe you or I did. They just feel like, if this isn't for me and you guys aren't walking the talk,
Right.
then I'll go somewhere else.
Yeah.
Um,
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So, one of the things we've seen, to your very good point, is this unrest has created, probably, at least in my lifetime, more corporate actions than I've seen, right? At least more publicly recognizable corporate actions. And, sometimes you're having conversation with folks and they go, well, that looks genuine. That one doesn't look genuine. Looks like they just crumbled under pressure. And you can go, well, is it or is it not? And to a certain degree, you know what? In the pot of interest right now, we'll take it all.
yeah.
I think we'll take it all, right? Whether it's genuine or not. And we just have to hold them to it. But you used a very good word, which was accountability. When you think about that and start to think about, again, the space of higher ed and what it is in control of,
Mm-hmm.
how are you starting to feel, assess, connected to your first points around your role, even in your new seat, right? How do you think about settling into accountability for what Kellogg has started to commit to or not? How are you feeling about that?
Yeah. So, I think many of us at Kellogg feel like this is this is an opportunity to actually reframe a lot of what we've talked about
Mm-hmm.
and restate. And lastly, I think find our purpose in a way, refind our purpose. So every school has its own unique personality, I think, and Kellogg has had this personality for years of being collaborative, of being innovative and creative. I will use the word empathy. We're talking a lot about that right now and how to create extraordinary, empathetic leaders. But the part that I really like is the focus on trust and transparency,
Mm-hmm.
right? So there was a professor who was a mentor of mine. Unfortunately, he passed away a few years ago, Keith Murnigan. And he said, why don't we start with a premise that I trust you? Instead of the old phrase, you have to earn my trust, walk in the door and I trust you.
Mm-hmm.
And look, it's amazing how things change when you have that attitude. And this is something that we'll talk to our students about all the time.
Right.
Now, trust also means your intentions are positive. You may not always get it right, but your intentions, I trust that your intentions, James, are positive and you're trying to move the organization forward or you're trying to move the school forward. So we've got to start with the fact that we have to have trust in this process, because stakeholders are students, faculty, alumni, the rest of the university staff, and then transparency. So if we're setting an objective that we want um, X% of our students to be Black or African American by Y year, we got to measure it and we have to report on it. And we're going to do it not just internally, but we're going to do it externally. So as we go through this process, transparency is paramount, but everybody has to start with the fact that there's a trust-based system, because the metrics and the targets have to be built from everybody working together and understanding all the implications of what that metric means, right? So, we've got constituents that, business schools and universities are kind of interesting. Organizations typically have employees, customers, shareholders, or a board or something like that. And that can define, maybe vendors, that can define the constituency base. I'm not saying it's better or worse or harder or easier, but universities have many different stakeholders. So we've got to start from a basis of trust, build transparency around what we're going to measure it, be accountable for it, and be ready to say, were we right? Were we wrong? Did we get it right? Did we not get it right? Adapt and continue to move on.
Yeah. Yeah. I was thinking through, as you were talking about those stakeholders, and I don't envy your position and Dean, I always mess her name up. I call her Dean Steve.
Cornelli.
Yeah, Cornelli.
Yeah.
I don't envy the position, right, of dealing with those who help fund the endowments, et cetera, and all the work you guys have to do to keep those conversations going and building that population. The one thing, though, I think about is, how do you, it's almost like when you have a major strategic initiative inside a company, right? You need to go sell in a committee, and that committee's 20 people. Those of us who've ever done it, you don't walk in cold and try to sell all 20 people. You have to pre-sell at least half the room. So you walk in and you've got the vote, right? And so on this one, I kind of think about it through a couple of different layers of it. One, we've seen some great academics help solve some of the world's most challenging problems, right? And I think even now, you think about Harvard Business Review's readership of over 250,000 folks, right, who are problem solvers by their very nature, right? If we were to turn this thing on its head and make it, and higher ed decided it was one of the top problems, right? Or we need an Elon Musk type to come dedicated. Right? How do we do that? Is there a way to go that course that it gets lift? Because what I worry about, quite honestly, is the what's the word I'm looking for? Let me take it out of this one and use another metaphor to help bring it home. Is almost like there's a reason churches have soup kitchens, right? I'm not just going to pray for you. I'm going to pray for you and feed you. Yeah. Right. The pray for you is almost like, that means I think you'll just sustain your life and you'll continue to live. Right. And I'm telling you, no, I'm dying. Pray for you and feed you is acknowledgement that you heard me. Right. And this is back to the empathy point. And so I'm just looking for that sense of urgency to make that declaration of, no, we actually have to fix this. And we're going to free up the resources that, again, are in our control, as we've done for energy or conservation or.
Absolutely. And I think it's a really fair question. And I think a really important question for Kellogg. I want to solve it for Kellogg because I want Kellogg to be the best in this regard. I think we have a great opportunity to do it. So, not to sound trite or anything, but there are exercises that we look at, like something called Kill the Company. I don't know if you've heard of this exercise, but you bring some people together at all different levels of the organization, not that many, because you don't want it too big. And you say, all right, we're going to create a school and it's going to compete against Kellogg and Harvard and Stanford and Chicago. But we're going to solve this problem of systemic racism in higher ed, representation of African Americans, Latinx, whatever it might be. How do we do it? And you take the boundaries away
Mm.
of what the inertia has led you to, and you map this out. So that's just one example. The other thing I think we're doing a lot more of now is talking to people like you, James, and other leaders in organizations that set the mark and do this really well, and have them tell us, what did you do?
Mm.
How did you do it? So last week we had a conversation with a couple of alums, like Melissa Thomas Hunt, who got her doctorate at Kellogg, and she's now Chief Diversity Officer at Airbnb, right? And she talked about their process for thinking about employee retention and how they value employees and what's important. Even in a down market for Airbnb, but the mental approach of how they're thinking about all of these things. So the other incredible value that we have as an institution of higher learning is incredible alums who are successful, and we want them at this point to teach us and hold us accountable for the measures that we collectively put together. Now, is that the urgency in that, to your point, which is a great point. The urgency is, once we ask them their opinion, they're not going to let us, slow walk this thing into the next 5 years.
Right.
They're going to demand, because it's their brand, they're going to demand that we keep this moving positively forward, and we win. And I think win in this case means we become a school that attracts people from every culture, every race, and we get to share in their success as they come in the door and go on and graduate.
Yeah. And to your point, if we're living into those tenets of I think you said trust and transparency, right?
Yeah.
Then one or two things has to be true. If we believe in a business case, then we're going to do it and keep to it. If we don't, then we need to own up and say we don't, and this does not make the priority list.
Yeah. And that's the transparency part, right?
Absolutely.
But I can tell you, we believe in the business case.
Right.
And I think and it will take, not to overuse another term, but I think it will take all of us. I don't want to say an army, but it will take all of us to make this happen.
Right.
And change, we talked about this a little bit ahead of time, but this is a change process, right? So if we are also going back to the frameworks of what it takes to create significant change and positive change, and what are the frameworks by which we make that happen. So this is also a case where we have to practice what we teach. We have to be able to look at the modes of unfreeze, movement, and refreeze in the place where we want to be, and make sure that the processes and the systems and the rhythms and the rituals and the artifacts that we create are the right ones for the right people to be at our school.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah.
Well, as we start to wrap up, I'll ask you one last question, and let me underscore this 3 times. In an unconstrained world of higher education, if you were totally unconstrained, right?
Yeah.
You are the Dean C, you are the folks filling the endowment. You've got total control. What's the big idea? What would you do if it were unconstrained?
Yeah, I think there's this idea that access should be unfettered. So everything from what's it going to cost me to attend, and what's it going to take for me to actually be there, combined with we know how to put you in a job after you're done that we know you're going to thrive in and you're going to change the world. Right. So I think for us, it would never be a transactional relationship. Your future success not because we want you to give money. That's okay too. But our belief is that if we create the right extraordinary leaders, they're going to go out and change the world. And that's part of our job.
Right.
So the unfettered access, what do we measure by entrance exams?
Mm-hmm.
How well you take a test, maybe, right? So this is Greg Hanifee's opinion.
Right.
Do we need that? Or do we look at your undergraduate performance? We look at your work experience. We talk to a couple of people that you have us in your recommendation. We look at how well you write. And, there's an interview in there just so we can tell what kind of person you might really want to be. But will that exam really matter? I think the other part is some creativity around how all this is financed.
Mm.
And there's some models out there. Now I'm really getting into the sort of the Greg Hanifee world here, where I've been thinking about something that's done in Europe a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
Purdue University does this, but it's an income share agreement model.
Mm.
So James is coming in. He's had his undergraduate degree from Temple. I'm making it up, right? And he wants to go off and work in finance at Allstate, or he wants to work in marketing at Allstate. I can project the likelihood that James is going to earn X million or X $100,000 over the next 10 years. Why don't I take a bet on him and just take a percentage of his salary that pays for the education?
Right.
So it's more investing the other way around. You're betting that you're going to have a successful career if you go through Kellogg.
Right.
And what we're saying is that's great. All we want to do is there's a maximum amount of money, and we'll just figure out what the actuarial table might say, or to make that happen. So I think some of those things are not brand new ideas. There are coding schools that do that today.
Mm-hmm.
Now the question is whether the rest of higher ed may do something like that.
Yeah, no, that's interesting. You triggered a thought too, particularly when you said Temple and the ISA thing, because that would have helped me big time. I'm not sure if I ever told you this story. So, my last year of high school, we had just a series of unfortunate events where I dropped out of high school for a while. Take care of our home. My father just went through just a terrible season and so on and so forth. So I tried to man up, take care of the house, which just couldn't happen. Right.
Yeah.
So I go back to school. I get my grades in order. I wanted to be a comms major. I go to Temple. For a day. They call me down to the bursar's office and tell me my financial aid didn't go through, nor could I get grants. And like, you're in this sliver, which like probably less than 1% hits in, where your mom makes too much for grants.
Yeah.
Is not qualifying for financial aid. I'm like, okay, so what do we do? There's like, they said, well, there is no, what do we do? You're out. I'm like, what do you mean I'm out? You're out.
I did not. Yeah.
Greg, they like sent me home. Right now, I'm gonna be honest. I was broke.
Yeah.
I mean, I had, after coming off the high school thing, and Channel 10 had recognized me for like most improved student of the city. I was riding high. I'm finally going to college to be a comms major. I interviewed my favorite DJ in the city, which was Doug Henderson. This was, man, I was committed. And then I got booted out of Temple, and I was just in a state of disbelief. So then I just went and worked. Right. And I'm having some good mentors, and I didn't go back and finish my undergrad until my 30s, going to school at night. Yeah. So coming to Kellogg was almost, I was in disbelief coming to Kellogg because I didn't think I would make it in. I'm like, I've had this really rough ride, but to the point of unfettered access, or ISA, right? That would be tremendous. I would have signed up. I had all the tenacity in the world. I would have pursued and worked my way through it.
And I guarantee you, somebody would have bet on you with the story that you had coming in. I mean, that's, smart business people know how to invest in grit and passion. And so I think that all fits together. And credit to you. I think that's also why Kellogg loved having you come in, because you had this incredible story of achievement when everything else was telling you, hey, you can't do it.
Mm-hmm.
And I think these sort of non-traditional paths are really something that, no constraints. That's what we should be thinking about.
Yeah, I love that.
Yeah.
Well,
Yeah.
great. Thank you for spending your time. I know, again, you've got so much going on with both your new role and trying to figure out solutions to what we're dealing with in the world right now. So I appreciate it.
James, my pleasure. And thank you for your friendship, your honesty. And I look forward to catching up via virtual or someday down the road in person
I'm
again.
down the road soon, right?
Yeah. Keep doing the good work. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.